Colchester is a relatively quiet town in Essex, in the southeast of England, but it's been in the news for all the wrong reasons over the last 2 decades. Firstly, in 2006, during the hunt for the Suffolk Strangler, Stephen Wright, due to one of his 5 victims living in the town, and his hunting ground being only a short distance away. However, the people of Colchester were gripped by fear more recently, in 2014, when 2 people were stabbed to death, apparently at random. Their murderer, James Fairweather, was 15 years old at the time, and freely admitted that, at the time of his arrest, he was searching for his 3rd victim and wished to become a serial killer. Welcome to Evil Among Us. In 2014, James Atfield was 29 years old, and his life had unfortunately deteriorated massively in the last 4 years due to him having been in a serious car accident in 2010, which left him with brain damage and significant disabilities. He'd cut himself off from his 5 children and was trying to come to terms with the changes in his life, and had turned to alcohol use as a way to cope with his depression. On the 28th of March 2014, James went into Colchester town centre and was consuming alcohol heavily. This footage shows his final movements just hours before his death. By 1 a.m. on the 29th of March, he was sleeping off the effects of the alcohol in Castle Park. A member of the public came across him and asked if he was all right, to which James said he was, and he was warned to be careful sleeping in the park. Unfortunately, little did he know that James Fairweather, a 15-year-old serial killer-obsessed schoolboy, had snuck out of the family home about 2 miles away, armed with a knife and wearing gloves, roaming the streets looking for someone to kill. Sometime between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m, Fairweather came across James whilst he was asleep and attacked him. Fairweather first stabbed James in the stomach 4 or 5 times, then went to stab him in the side of the head but missed, and ended up stabbing him in the eye. However, James did not stay unconscious for long, and he screamed when he was stabbed in the eye and tried to fight back, with him receiving defensive wounds as he fought for his life. Fairweather then went into a frenzy and stabbed James 102 times. This included numerous stab wounds to the head and several stab wounds in the side of his neck, which severed his jugular vein. Fairweather then saw a light and thought someone was coming, and so fled the scene. However, James was not dead, and when he was found by a member of the public at just before 6 a.m, he was still alive, although suffering from horrific injuries, with him essentially having been butchered by Fairweather. James unfortunately was pronounced dead just half an hour later. Fairweather disposed of the knife and put his bloody clothes in a bin bag to be collected by the bin men, and went about his day, convinced that no one would link him to the crime, and, unfortunately, he was right. We all have a fear of the big bad stranger who might harm us, but in fact stranger murders are actually quite rare, and people know their murderers in approximately 70 to 80% of cases. Stranger murders are the hardest to solve, as there's no obvious motive and no link between offender and victim. Due to this, it's clear that Essex police were struggling to identify a suspect, and they arrested at least 9 people across the county on suspicion of murder, not realising that the killer was on their doorstep. Nearly 3 months later, Fairweather was again on the prowl, looking for someone to kill. Armed with a bayonet-type knife, he waited along a path known as the Salary Brook Trail. It's clear that Fairweather was becoming more confident and brazen in his offending. Whilst the first murder was approximately 2 miles from his home address, the next one occurred almost on his doorstep, as shown by this map, with the trail marked in green and the approximate location of Fairweather's home, based on media reports, being in or around the black circle. Fairweather was looking for a victim, when he unfortunately came across Nahid Al-Mania, a 31-year-old Saudi Arabian woman studying at the University of Essex. The trail is an easy access route between where Nahid lived in an area known as Greenstead and the university. It's not an area that someone would probably be walking at night, but during the day it's considered safe. Unfortunately, on this occasion this was not the case, and the offence occurred in broad daylight at 10:30 a.m. Just before the attack, Nahid was walking to the university. There are no pictures of Nahid, which were released by her family, which is obviously their choice, only grainy CCTV footage of her last moments. Nahid didn't stand a chance. She was approached from behind by Fairweather, who stabbed her in the back and then spun her around. He knocked off the sunglasses she was wearing and stabbed her in the eye. She then fell to the floor, causing a fracture to the back of her skull. Fairweather then stabbed Nahid in the other eye, with these injuries being delivered with such force that the knife penetrated her brain. Fairweather would later claim that he went into a, quote, frenzy, during which time he stabbed her repeatedly. However, this was contradicted by the pathologist, who indicated that some of the 16 stab wounds on Naheed's body appeared to have been controlled injuries, suggesting they were inflicted to cause the maximum amount of pain, as opposed to specifically killing her. Naheed was discovered by a passerby a short time later, and the sight they saw was gruesome, with them initially describing that they thought Naheed's face had been, quote, smashed in, and that one of her eyes was, quote, hanging out of the socket. Paramedics attended the scene, but there was nothing that could be done for Naheed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene at 11 a.m. Fairweather again disposed of the knife and put his bloody clothes into a bin bag to be collected with the other rubbish. Again, the police were at a loss as to who the perpetrator could have been, and they questioned 70 of the locals. This did include Fairweather, due to a previous knife crime, which we'll return to shortly, but he gave an alibi and was not questioned again. By January 2015, the police had spoken to 900 potential witnesses, but were no closer to finding a suspect, with them potentially believing that 2 separate offenders had committed these crimes. The concern in Colchester was palpable. Arrangements had been made to cut foliage down on various paths to reduce the places where a murderer could hide, and guidance about safety, including not travelling alone, was disseminated to the town as a whole, but particularly the university. However, just a few months later, the perpetrator would fall into their lap. On the 25th of May 2015, this woman, Michelle Sadler, was walking her dog in the early morning when she saw Fairweather loitering and acting suspiciously in some undergrowth in an area close to where Naheed had been murdered, so again, basically on his doorstep. Michelle was later referred to as a hero in subsequent news reports, and I think this is an accurate description. Due to her next simple action, she called the police. Police attended and found Fairweather wearing gloves and armed with this knife, and arrested him on the scene. He would later confess to the fact that he was loitering, looking for a third person to kill. It's important at this point to give a little bit of background regarding James Fairweather. He was 15 at the time of these killings, but already had an alarming history. A search of the home he shared with his family showed his obsession with serial killers and violent movies. He was particularly interested in Peter Sutcliffe and cited Ted Bundy as his favourite serial killer. It's believed that Fairweather stabbed his victims in the eyes to emulate Sutcliffe, with him apparently doing this to one of his victims. He also had a collection of gory horror movies, including Wrong Turn, a slasher film where a group of individuals are stalked by a family of cannibals. It appears that Fairweather was obsessed with murder and wished to emulate what he saw. In terms of criminal history, in January 2014, Fairweather robbed his local newsagents at knife point, which he later described as a tester for his future offences. Fairweather was caught for this offence because he bragged to his friends about what he had done, and was in court just 3 days before he murdered James Atfield, where he walked free with an order to work with the Youth Offending Services. The police had no idea that Fairweather was the person they were after for the double murders until he gleefully confessed. He freely confessed that he'd spent the year after the second murder fantasising about killing as well as raping others, and was on his way to do this when he was caught. Here is a clip of his interrogation video, where he joyfully recounts slaughtering James Atfield.
Because my voices were talking to me, you need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you, you need to do it. And I saw him, it was laying on the grass, like that, it was like that, just fast asleep, where he was drunk. Then he goes, he's the one, do it. So I went up to him, can I stand up? No.
Yes.
Went up to him, stood over like that, not helping that. So I stabbed him first there, and I'd done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and louder and louder.
This clip is interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, it gives an insight into Fairweather's motivation for this confession, specifically recognition. He is revelling in the attention from telling the police exactly what he's done. Basically, he thinks, what's the point of doing these things if I can't brag about them? However, the second thing is that he's clearly come up with a defence, which is basically, the voices made me do it, with him claiming that he was hearing evil voices which told him to kill. Essentially, he's setting up a defence of mental illness so he can plead to lesser charges. This speaks to the dichotomy of Fairweather, with him saying on the one hand, of course I want to take credit for these things, but on the other hand saying, I don't want to be punished too severely for them, so he's saying, "Give me praise and let me out as soon as possible to kill again." His tactic reminds me somewhat of Kenneth Bianchi, one of the hillside stranglers who killed 12 women in Rochester, New York in the late 1970s, with him claiming that he had multiple personalities and it was his alter egos which committed the murders. However, there was a strong smell of bullshit in the court at the time, and Bianchi was sent to prison forever. In January 2016, the case went for trial at the Old Bailey in London, after Fairweather, aged 17 by this point, pleaded not guilty to murder but indicated that he would plead to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. As I mentioned in a previous video, in the UK, manslaughter is where a person kills someone but did not mean to cause their death, only to cause them serious injury. It's all about intent to kill, and, in the case of Fairweather, he was clearly angling to argue that because he heard voices, he was not in the right state of mind and so couldn't be argued to have formed the intent to do what he did. Fairweather also claimed that because of his mental health issues, he couldn't actually remember the murders. However, the pile of bullshit that was hanging around outside the Bianchi trial seems to have dragged itself to this hearing, and Fairweather was found guilty of both the murders of James Atfield and Nahid Al-Mania. On the 29th of April 2016, Fairweather was due to be sentenced before Mr. Justice Spencer, who stated that the only explanation for Fairweather's behaviour was, quote, "You must be a psychopath," and that the wound pattern on both victims indicated that he had deliberately intended to cause them pain and anguish, something that inevitably excited him. He then passed sentence. Justice Spencer stated, had Fairweather been an adult, the starting point for these offences would have been in excess of 30 years in prison, but because of his youth, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 27 years before he can apply for parole. So the judge described Fairweather as a psychopath, but what is a psychopath? This is one of those loaded words that automatically brings to mind images of violent axe-wielding maniacs. Even with me, it brings into mind various people, including fictional ones, such as the character of Patrick Bateman from the film American Psycho. However, that's not what psychopathy is, and while some murderers and violent offenders are psychopaths, the two are not always linked. Psychopathy is a personality disorder, which is a lifelong pattern of problematic attitudes and beliefs and behaviours. There are many other types of personality disorder, including emotionally unstable, narcissistic, and dependent, all of which affect how people function in different ways. With regards to psychopathy, sufferers often have the following traits: behaviour that conflicts with social norms, disregarding or violating the rights of others, inability to distinguish between right and wrong, difficulty with showing remorse or empathy, tendency to lie often, and manipulating and hurting others. They are not automatically violent. There are plenty of psychopaths in society who have never violently harmed anyone, and these people can sometimes be found at the top of their industries, in part because they are ruthless and have little regard for who they step over to get there. However, when these individuals have violent attitudes and beliefs thrown into the mix, you have a recipe for disaster, as they have little barriers which will stop them, like most of society, acting on these thoughts, for example, not wanting to hurt anyone else. So like Fairweather, you can be faced with someone who can kill without conscience and will keep on killing until they are stopped. Luckily, Fairweather was stopped early in his killing spree. I've no doubt he would have carried on killing. Fairweather had a lot of material about serial killers as well as violent movies in his property, but it's not a case that this material caused him to kill. He already had this potential. In the words of Billy Loomis from the original Scream film, quote, "Movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative." I think that Fairweather saw the power and infamy that people like Ted Bundy and Peter Sutcliffe receive and wanted that level of recognition. The way they killed their victims and the way the people were killed in the horror movies he saw simply gave him ideas of how he could achieve his overall goal. Psychopathy, like other personality disorders, is a lifelong condition. It's just about managing symptoms. In this respect, James Fairweather will always be a psychopath. There is no magic cure or pill which will give him empathy. There are therapies, but ultimately the best outcome will be that he's able to mirror the behaviour of law-abiding people and follow rules even if he doesn't agree or understand them. It will be for the parole board to make the decision about his release when he is at least in his mid-40s, but if deemed a danger at that point, he could well remain in prison for the rest of his life. So, what are your thoughts on this case? Had you heard about the crimes of James Fairweather before? Why do you think he did what he did? Feel free to comment, and any suggestions for future videos will be greatly received. I also want to say thank you for the views I've had so far, as well as the subs I've picked up. This is a new channel and I'm committed to making it a success, so please keep watching and subscribe if you want to, as knowing someone out there on the interweb is watching gives me the drive to keep making videos. Anyway, as ever, see you in the next one.